All righty. Okay. Hello. It's the 11th of February. Jesus, time flies. Uh, there's a conference I should be attending, I think tomorrow, but I won't because it's too expensive and I'm not looking for a job. So anyway, but it's there. Uh, welcome to Dis and Dat information and on the autonomouscollective.net. Looking at materialism and capitalism, which I chose today because its author is, for whatever reason, is giving a talk in Japan. I think at 2 in the morning tonight. At 2 in the morning, I think I never understand that antipode or the um, Japanese time. It escapes me that it is yesterday or whatever there. So anyway, it's at 4 o'clock Japan time, Tokyo time. It's at the University of Tokyo. I've included on this particular page the Zoom access info. So, and that's further down on the page, and I'll show that in a moment. The reason why I chose Carl Wunderlind, um, professor of history at Columbia, not well, partially because he's talking in Japan, but particularly he's talking on this. I assume he's just going to read from this. Hello, pronto.
Oh, you're back. You went off there. Yes, you're back.
Uh, hello. Anyway, it's he's a professor of history. Uh, did the usual job of sticking it out in one place and getting a gig, and that's a good thing. What's also interesting, I think, is in reading his books that he's able to essentially give you a historical materialist argument without admitting, and not unlike being a Marxist, that he is a kind of a historical materialist. Um, and he has a thing he's doing, and I think it's the next generation of scholarship, I suppose. Certain ideas are in there that are good, interesting, um, not so problematic. I mean, if you're a kind of orthodox Marxist, it's annoying in certain places, but for the most part, it's a history of ideas approach that is, I think, that includes, of course, materialism, and I think uh, it reads okay. It's interesting and exciting. The idea that he could weave together alchemy, for example, and talking about the history of credit. And I think that it's just cool that he's doing it, and I'm grateful to read more humanities in that context. So I'm just going to read from this shorter article, which you will probably read during the talk that he's doing in Japan, um, because it has almost the same title. Um, he's done a lot of other things. He does a range of things, and his the historical period that he's generally working in is about the 17th and 18th centuries, before the his history of credit is on um, is pre French Revolution, for example, but it is mainly on the rise of the British financial revolution, and he's done a book on scarcity. Um, now, the reality of scarcity is that yes, there is scarcity, but scarcity is taught in a very different way in the context of neoclassical economics, where you presume scarcity is on the one hand, a permanent thing relative to the provision of nature, um, because there are limits. On the other hand, when you model a consumer culture, scarcity is a poor construction in some ways. So he's kind of got both things going on, and his credit book has a certain sense of the expectation of how different a set of different ideas, a kind of political economy, a knowledge economy is constructed. So I find it very useful that things that we would normally apply to later centuries is being sort of retconned, as it were, into the earlier historical periods. And I just think that's useful and interesting and worth reading. And his writing is okay. Okay, here it is, Carl Wennerland, Barnard College, Columbia. To merely focus on the economic institutions of capitalism is not sufficient to explain humanity's massive success in transmogrifying nature into economic wealth. In order to access the real story behind the radical transformations of the earth, the built environment, the world of goods, and therefore our way of life, we have to turn our attention to humanity's systematic conquest of nature, in particular, the quest to control matter and energy. First, we must address how people from all walks of life have investigated, excavated, and extracted natural resources across the globe, above and below ground, above and below the surface of the oceans, and soon in outer space. This quest was initially spearheaded by European empires, but has since become universalized under the twin banners of economic growth and development. Second, we must focus on how humanity has subjected the inner workings of nature to intense scrutiny. From at least the 17th century forward, generations have studied the causal mechanisms at work in nature through alchemy, chemistry, physics, mechanics, geology, biology, zoology, and so on, all with the Baconian intent of operationalizing knowledge so that matter and energy can be used for economic enrichment. The resulting expertise has allowed humanity to move from a reliance on muscular energy, 90 watts, and draft animals, 800 watts, to steam turbines, 1 megawatt, and nuclear reactors, 1 gigawatt. This, just to note here, this comes from a guy by the name of, I think it's Václav Simmel, Energy and Civilization, which is even more interesting. This guy Simmel has written a lot of interesting books, and somehow nobody talks about them, which I find fascinating because he has this whole thing that is actually quite useful and interesting, and perhaps we will talk about that later on. Clearly, capitalism would have manifested differently without the ability to command energy on this scale. Our control over matter and energy has also enabled us to fundamentally transform the material world, to use things like sand to create glass, concrete, silicon, semiconductors, and fiber optics, all of which, in their own way, have had a massive impact on the world. Moreover, through their experimentation with heat and pressure, scientists, artisans, mining experts, and entrepreneurs have figured out how to refine Earth's metals, including iron, copper, aluminum, cobalt, and lithium, in ways that have enabled the actualization of marvelous technological inventions. Our deep understanding of the chemical composition of nature has allowed us to form new matter, transform the human body, and make nature grow faster, or not at all. While the harnessing of fossil fuels is often credited with launching the first industrial revolution and the advancement in chemistry and electricity as the source of the second, an argument can be made that all hitherto industrial revolutions have relied on breakthroughs in knowledge and of matter and energy. Focusing on the materiality of capitalism opens up an entirely different way of seeing both the sublime wonders and the cataclysmic destruction brought about by capitalism. Had Western societies not been systematically dedicated to the conquest of territory across the globe and the development of economically utilitarian natural knowledge, it would have not mattered what institutions they organized themselves around. They could have had all the property rights, labor, markets, and money, the highest trust and the lowest transaction costs, but the world would not have been transformed in the radical manner that it has been during the last 400 years. Arguably, the Great Divergence, predicated on Britain using ghost acres in its colonies and developing ways to put its coal resources to productive use would not have taken place. Without constantly expanding its understanding and pursuing the exploitation of nature's untapped resources, humanity would never have been able to turn nature into skyscrapers, spacecraft, and quantum computers, nor to have had such a massive impact on Earth systems, biodiversity, and climate. The, the economists' focus on institutions and their abstractions from the material world would have long histories. Abstractions from the material world would have long histories dating at least back to the 17th century. For about a century, however, a distinct school of thought challenged the traditional political economy built around Hobbes, Locke, Hume, and Smith's perspectives on wealth formation, what he calls humanist jurisprudential political economy, HJPE. Whereas Smith et al. Focus on labor as the primary source of wealth, the alternate approach viewed the development of natural knowledge as the quintessence of wealth, built on the ideas of, among others, Francis Bacon, Samuel Hartlib, and Carl Linnaeus. Natural knowledge, political economy, NKPE, laid the foundation for an ambitious use of knowledge to discover and harness nature's potential abundance. This capacious intellectual tradition eventually lost the battle over the soul of economics, but by formulating a political economy of improvement around the conquest of nature, it can be said to have won the war over the spirit of capitalism. That is, while economists concentrated on the formalization of the study of relative prices, resource allocation, wealth distribution, and employment, generations of scientists, artisans, engineers, entrepreneurs, and inventors, having fully absorbed the NKPE worldview, have built modern capitalism through a never-ending pursuit of nature's secrets. While there were different versions in different places and times, the core of natural knowledge political economy, NKPE, centered on the idea that nature was a cornucopia, a source of infinite creativity and wealth. In his great wisdom, God had created a wonderful, almost magical system in which everything was designed to ultimately benefit humanity. In the spirit of physico-theology, Linnaeus, for example, proclaimed that God had created a universal order and that he had a definite purpose for every created thing. Nature never ceased to produce wealth. Day and night, a dizzying array of processes tirelessly operated to provide people with all that they needed to thrive. Nothing had been created in vain or without purpose. Every insect, every herb, every crustacean, every weed, every soil, every mammal, every plant, every mineral, every tree had a unique purpose within a marvelously complex system in which everything was interconnected. The sun, clouds, wind, snow, rain, it's something I like about his writing style. The sun, clouds, wind, snow, rain, oceans, lakes, rivers, mountains provided essential services that enabled all species to prosper on Earth. Even though nature was so vast that no human mind could fully grasp it, 17th century philosophical luminaries such as Francis Bacon, Rene Descartes, and John Comenius insisted that humanity had at its disposal the tools to investigate nature and incrementally gain knowledge of its multiple processes. Descartes, for example, believed humanity had the capacity to become lords and masters of nature by promoting and spreading a practical philosophy throughout society. By knowing the nature and behavior of fire, water, stars, the heavens, and all the other bodies which surround us, it would become possible for people to bring about the invention of an infinity of devices that would enable them to enjoy the fruits of agriculture and all the wealth of the earth without labor. In a similar spirit, but drawing on Paracelsus and Bacon, Hartlib and his circle called for humanity to orchestrate a massive collaborative campaign to develop knowledge of nature. They anticipated the discovery of a host of new medicines, materials, metals, foods, animals, tools, machines, all of which would enable people to live longer, healthier, and more prosperous lives. For this endeavor to bear fruit, it was not sufficient for only scientists to be engaged in the improvement process. Farmers, soldiers, artisans, mining experts, manufacturers, merchants, and priests should be mobilized to investigate and experiment on their surroundings. While as yet humanity had only scratched the surface of the benefits that natural knowledge could provide, a glorious future awaited them all. The focus of this improvement ideology was to understand nature's own processes and develop ways to harness them. According to the Paracelsian alchemical tradition, if humanity could understand why and how a plant emerges from a seed, draws nutrients from the soil, absorbs water from the ground, dies in autumn, and revives in spring, humanity might be able to exploit this knowledge of the causal mechanisms at work in nature for its own economic benefit. For that purpose, as Bacon described in his New Atlantis, research campuses similar to Solomon's house should be erected in which intelligencers, virtuosos, scientists, and improvers could come together in pursuit of new knowledge about the natural world. They should experiment on ways to improve the fertility of different soils, fruits, and plants, and figure out ways to combine them to produce new kinds. They should experiment on minerals, metals, and stones, studying how they react to different elements, heat, pressure, and altitude. This would also help in the creation of new composite materials with desirable properties. As part of these methods, it was essential to develop and refine scientific instruments such as the microscope, telescope, and the air pump that made the invisible legible. Animals should also be studied, as greater knowledge would allow humans to make them smaller, bigger, stronger, more obedient, or tastier. NKPE was based on an audacious program to master nature and to transform it for human improvement. Soon, European states, including England, France, and Sweden, embraced these improvement ideas and instituted the Royal Society of 1660, the Académie des Sciences 1666, and instituted the Royal Society. And Conjunglia Vetenskapsakademien of 1739. Yet, it should be noted that most writers contributing to the development of the new political economy did not believe that scientists in state-supported academies could on their own launch a new era of progress. Oh, yeah, it should stop funding those things. They advocated for and hoped to inspire an inclusive culture of utilitarian knowledge formation. Indeed, to many of them, this culture already existed. They did not suffer the illusion that they were inventing or discovering the importance of knowledge to the creation of wealth. Their aim through their writings was to further encourage the vibrancy of this culture. By offering a worldview in which knowledge was the protagonist, they sought to valorize its pursuit. At a moment when someone like John Locke, despite being a member of the Royal Society, proclaimed that young gentlemen should be only sparsely exposed to natural philosophy, it was important to endorse the legitimacy of a life spent in the pursuit of utilitarian knowledge. For example, had there not existed a developed political economy focused on natural knowledge in Sweden during the first half of the 18th century, it might have been more difficult for the young Linnaeus to pursue his passion for botany. Instead, he may have had no choice but to follow in his father's footsteps and become a priest. In a society in which people recognize the potential of new knowledge to prolong people's lives, enable them to enjoy greater material abundance, and promote the nation's geopolitical prowess, it was also more likely that governments, regional and national, would allocate resources in support of knowledge formation and its dissemination, in particular by promoting the teaching of basic natural knowledge and skills of knowledge formation. Inspired by this worldview, seasoned and budding entrepreneurs would also be more likely to commit themselves to the search for more and better applications of natural knowledge and thereby be able to add to the ever expanding world of goods. Inasmuch as all of nature was interlinked, all human knowledge was interconnected. To foster the greatest improvement, it was therefore essential that all forms of natural knowledge were pursued, promoted, and widely disseminated. Mathematics, physics, alchemy, mechanics, engineering, anatomy, botany, horticulture, agriculture, mineralogy, and so forth were all crucial ingredients of progress. Comenius insisted that humanity should strive for universal knowledge, which, if combined with the proper social and educational reforms, would facilitate a universal reformation. In addition to these various scientific pursuits designed to expand knowledge about the inner workings of nature, was also essential in the spirit of Carl Linnaeus's apostles to set out across the world to discover the infinite variety of species in nature. Exploration, discovery, and colonization were integral to this notion of improvement. New animals, plants, minerals, grasses, soils, and so on had to be discovered and investigated. Nature had to be accounted for through the establishment of detailed inventories. Literally, no stone should be left unturned. The improvement writers were practical and utilitarian. Many of them did not emerge from the classical humanist scholarly tradition, nor were they committed to the formation of a secular understanding of society and nature. For them, the Bible and the book of nature served as companion tools. In many cases, a deep spirituality informed their understanding of nature. Many marveled at the sublime divine power infused in nature, the providential equilibrium that forged an ecological balance, and the magical fecundity of nature. Indeed, there was a strong current running through the improvement discourse that was not just about utility, but that also characterized nature as aesthetic and spiritual, often as part of a broader millenarian view. Drawing on Paracelsian prophecies, many nations saw themselves as having been blessed by God with a particularly bountiful nature. They took it to be God's will that their nation would become wealthy and powerful. The natural knowledge political economy, the NKPE, differed fundamentally from the humanist jurisprudential political economy, the HJPE, which was developing around the same time throughout Europe, most famously in Britain. This intellectual tradition would later lay the foundation for classical political economy and eventually marginalism and modern economics. The most important writers in this tradition included Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, David Hume, and Adam Smith. Nature for them was not a mysterious source of wealth and prosperity. It existed instead as dead matter, a passive resource awaiting the magic touch of labor. Their primary concern with the natural world was how to best organize the ownership of it, incentivize labor on it, and distribute the resulting products through markets. Property was the necessary condition, but labor was the active ingredient, the kernel of wealth. Hobbes was writing during the same era as Hartleb, Comenius, and Descartes. He undoubtedly recognized the importance of the advancement of natural knowledge, but he spent most of his ink elaborating on the necessary institutions of society, in particular, the ideal political constitution. Yet, economic considerations provided an essential cornerstone of his political philosophy. He argued that at the core of a thriving and affluent society was private property. Without it, he famously proclaimed, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The reason for this is that no one works when the fruit of their labor is uncertain. And when people cease to engage in industry, there is no agriculture, manufacturing, technology, or trade. All of people's energies are then spent on trying to protect their food, houses, and families. This, he argued, was the condition that prevailed in many places in America. Another writer who used America as an example of what happens in the absence of private property was John Locke. He too argued that private property is the fundamental condition required for people to engage in industry. And industry, he argued, is the sine qua non of wealth creation. Indeed, Locke developed a highly influential labor theory of property and a labor theory of value. He argued that property is created when people mix their labor with nature. Nature was a gift of God, a smorgasbord of resources existing as a standing reserve for any person to improve with labor. The part of nature that the laborer tills, plants, improves, cultivates, and thereby turns into useful goods becomes that laborer's possession. Labor is not only the source of property, it is also the active ingredient in the creation of value. It is labor, Locke argued, that puts the difference of value on everything. While nature is a necessary component of wealth, it is the improvement that labor makes that accounts for almost all of the value. You can see why I've chosen this. He first estimated that labor is responsible for 90% of products useful to humanity, but later revised his position and claimed that labor is the source of 99% of value. He argued that people who carefully cultivate their enclosed land will produce as much on 10 acres as they could have from 100 left to nature. In effect, this amounted to the enclosing person providing a gift to society by multiplying the total available wealth by a factor of 10. Through the use of money and markets, the value created was disseminated throughout society as a form of lifeblood nourishing the population. The Scottish philosopher David Hume also conceived of private property and labor as the main institutions of capitalism. Like Hobbes and Locke, Hume insisted that the primary rationale for private property was that it incentivizes industry and thereby the creation of wealth. Hume defined the riches of a nation as its stock of labor or storehouse of labor. Hume also used labor to reconcile the tension between wealth and virtue that Herbert Mandeville had highlighted in his scandalous intervention, The Fable of the Bees. For Hume, industry was not only the primary source of wealth, but it was also the most important ingredient in people's moral refinement. He argued that those who engage in middle class professions such as commerce, finance, law, administration, manufacturing, and land improvement are shaped by the discipline, constancy, and problem solving required in their line of business. This not only creates more refined habits and customs, it also gives the mind new vigor and leads to the enlargement of its powers and faculties. As people become more refined through their diligent pursuit of the utilitarian ends, they also acquire certain greater moral facilities. Therefore, almost all the moral as well as natural evils of human life can be cured by industry. The emphasis on labor as the main source of wealth famously continued with Adam Smith. For him, the wealth of nations depends on the number of workers engaged in productive labor and the prevalent a degree of specialization. Always pursuing the intensification of the division of labor was thus the key to generating a steady expansion of wealth. As laborers each worked on an ever smaller part of the production process, their dexterity improved. They spent less time sauntering between tasks, and they were more likely to realize when machines could be substituted for certain tasks. As workers became more productive, more goods entered circulation, and the accumulation of capital accelerated. As a consequence, prices on goods went down, while increasing capital brought greater demand for labor and thus higher wages, both of which promoted affluence throughout the ranks. Specialized labor therefore promoted greater national wealth as well as greater prosperity for the general population. While Smith is most famous for his emphasis on labor as the source of enrichment, he acknowledged that labor is not the only productive resource. Instead, he wrote, the land constitutes by far the greatest, the most important, and the most durable part of the wealth of every extensive country. Moreover, he argued, much in the spirit of NKPE, that nature was a gift to humanity, one that keeps on giving. Nature's myriad of processes never cease to work for the benefit of humanity. Day after day, the sun, the rain, the earthworms, and the bees kept on contributing to the natural generation of wealth. Although uncompensated, this labor generated wealth. In agriculture, Smith noted, nature labors along with man, and through her labor costs no expense. Its produce has its value as well as that of the most expensive workman. To be more precise, Smith argued that nature's processes contribute somewhere between a fourth and a third of value. Smith's recognition that nature produces wealth may have come directly from his studies of the NKPE tradition. We know that he read Linnaeus while drafting The Wealth of Nations, but it is more likely that he absorbed it from the physiocrats whom he greatly admired. This French tradition of political economy emerged as a reaction to the French state's alleged preference for manufacturing over agriculture, in particular during the reign of Louis XIV, when Jean-Baptiste Colbert was in charge of economic statecraft. Dating back to at least the works of Francois Fénelon, there was a movement underway to force the state to recognize that all value stems from the land. It was the land that provided people with materials for food, clothes, and construction materials. In the spirit of vitalism, the physiocrats thought of nature not only as a series of chemical, biological, and physical processes, but also as infused with a spirit of creation and regeneration. But instead of training their analytical eyes on these productive processes, the physiocrats abstracted from the actual transformations and instead theorized nature in abstract value terms. You can see why Marx was amused by the physiocrats. They were particularly interested in the distribution of the value generated from the land. They insisted that a certain proportion of the surplus left over after landowners and workers had been paid, the produit net, had to be reinvested into agricultural improvement. That's valorization. If too much went to manufacturing, which from their point of view was sterile, society would eventually disintegrate from the resulting imbalance between town and country. This perspective led the physiocrats to focus most of their energies on the dynamics of markets rather than on the development of practical knowledge. In closing, it is, of course, impossible to do justice to the complexity of these two intellectual traditions in a brief essay. What I've offered here is a highly schematic version of a more complex argument I will make elsewhere. While there is certainly more overlap between the two traditions that I have indicated here, there's no denying that the two traditions were built on fundamentally different intellectual foundations and differed greatly in what they saw as the sources of wealth. Many of the writers in the NKPE tradition drew inspiration from Baconianism, Paracelsianism, and millenarianism. If humanity could gain power over nature through increased knowledge, discover nature's secrets and invisible forces with the aid of Hermeticism, and channel a deep faith in the possibility of a kingdom of heaven on earth, a trajectory of infinite improvement and universal reformation was considered possible. No region, whether internal to the nation or part of the empire, should be left unexplored. While the NKPE writers were certainly concerned with ethics and virtue, they were more likely to find those qualities embedded in nature than in political and economic institutions. In contrast, many of the HJPE writers were grounded in Aristotelianism, Epicureanism, and Renaissance humanism. Now, drawing on the rich intellectual tradition that J.G.A. Pocock would later capture in his Machiavellian moment, the HJPE writers developed an abstract discourse that first and foremost focused on the creation of wealth through labor, but also on the pursuit of individual happiness, liberty, and virtue. It was, in large part, a secular discourse that sought to explain how certain economic institutions might bring about not only economic prosperity, but the kind of moral values promoted in traditional Christianity as well. The aim of this essay is to invite conversation about what makes capitalism unique and to what extent modern economics and its forerunners captured its essence. My contention is that it is not its institutions that make capitalism sui generis, but rather its materiality. By materiality, quote unquote, I mean, in the spirit of Albert Einstein's E equals mc squared, that energy and matter are interchangeable different forms of the same thing. This is an ecological model, needless to say. I suggest that it is humanity's incessant pursuit of and success in conquering and harnessing nature's forces that set capitalism apart from previous social forms by generating a ceaseless economic growth that continuously transforms the material world as the material world we inhabit. It is the reason why capitalism, in Karl Marx's words, accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It is also the reason why we are currently facing a biodiversity, climate, and Earth systems crisis. Transforming nature into economic wealth generates tremendous environmental destruction, while the conquest of nature was front and center in Comenius's Hartlib's and Linnaeus's respective visions of improvement, for Hobbes, Hume, and Smith, it was labor and property that took center stage. As the thinking of the latter group came to define classical political economy, natural knowledge became increasingly marginal in 19th century treatises on economic issues. In the same vein that Marx criticized classical political economy for ignoring the social conditions of commodity production, it can be said that they, and even more so their modern descendants, turned a blind eye to the natural conditions of wealth creation and capitalism. Yet, as capitalism was gathering momentum in the real world, it was the NKPE tradition that provided the worldview in which people, corporations, and states pursued a never ending quest for wealth through the conquest of nature. So that's the end of that. Um, I think it's useful. It's pretty clear that he has a materialist perspective. For example, the footnote: "I view the Soviet economy as a form of capitalism, state capitalism, in the spirit of the Frankfurt School." You can see all this. There's Marxist stuff going on here. The economist great Kate Raworth called on economists to recognize the economy as an open system with large inflows and outflows of both energy and matter within our planet's unique and delicately balanced biosphere. She added, "Energy, not money, is the fundamental currency of life, underpinning all human, ecological, and industrial systems." Um, and then, of course, the Communist Manifesto itself. And then he just has a really interesting reading list, and his bibliography is quite cool as well. There's lots of good stuff in there, things that should be on my book pile, some that are, some that aren't, and some that are quite new, and stuff I got to read. And that book that he mentions at the beginning, the Václav Smil book, is actually quite interesting because it does speak in a very popular way the integration of energy and nature, and it's quite useful to think in those terms in an ostensibly ecological form, no different than Bellamy Foster et al. So where are we now on time? Close to the end of my little yammering here. Let me point out, of course, that I've included the introduction and the epilogue to his big book. I think this is his tenure book, Casualties of Credit, the English Financial Revolution. I know this sounds incredibly dry, but it actually he writes in a very interesting way, and it's worth it holds attention. The English Financial Revolution of 1620 to 1720 by Carl Wennerlin, 2011. And so it talks about the history of credit, and it's actually quite good because it talks about all the underlying conditions under which capitalists sort of trust each other, but they don't really trust each other, and that's the kind of beauty of what he's playing around with. And of course, in contrast, if we look at this any further, or if I look at it any further, I'm going to contrast this with David Graeber's book on debt. So you actually have both things, credit and debt. I mean, debt is discussed here, of course, as a function of credit, but it would be interesting to pair David Graeber's point of view with Wennerlin's point of view. Because obviously, Wennerlin here has these certain idealist things that he wants to integrate into the discourse, which is ostensibly necessary. Because if you're going to work with a history of ideas sort of a approach, you are going to have to reconcile it, I think, with material stuff. And I think he resolves himself ultimately to historical materialism. So, and this particular book on the credit, it does do a focus on the South Sea bubble, which is a serious scam. I mean, it's very famous. It's like the tulips, but this is the British version of the tulips, and it is a serious Bernie Madoff. It's more than that, I suppose. It's beyond Bernie Madoff, more like Bankman-Fried in terms of the size of the corruption in terms of GDP. Anyway, so I included that just in case you were interested. It covers it pretty much, and I included the Wikipedia short version. There was no realistic prospect that trade would take place, and it turned out huh, the company never realized any significant profit from its monopoly, because that's what the whole issue was in early joint stock uh, uh, company constructions. And so I included here the University of Tokyo note. And if you're better at reading Japanese time than I am, I think it works out to, and my assumption is that it's tonight at 2 a.m. Rather than today at 2 a.m., but I have no clue because I always get that confused. I've screwed this up a couple of times while trying to listen to something in Korea as well as Japan. So I continue to not be as globalized as I'd like to be. But anyway, I included that material because it includes the obviously physical location, but includes the Zoom details, meeting ID, and passcode. Um, so I assume he's actually going to read from this paper or something like it. Um, and the history of scarcity, humanity, nature, and the world of goods, I think is the new one that is coming out. It just came out, I think. And Hume's political economy. The other one that there's one that I wanted to read, and that it's his one on Atlantis, or it's an article on Atlantis that I want to read. And then I added from yesterday the interview with Paul Burkett or Burkett, and because I'm going to probably draw from that as we move forward. And I think I included a video at the end. Sorry. Uh, this the Burkett interview. Well, there's a video here. It's on the page. It's a Wennerlin lecture. So I think I've gotten to the end of my rope here. So let's see what the chat said. Uh, Einstein's great discovery. Cool. Yes, yes. Thank you for including Bellamy Foster, uh, because this is good. All good. All good. Uh, all righty. So that I let me. I've reached the end of my time. Let me stop the share, and that's very funny. Hair plugs.